The letter wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to my mother, but she handed it to me without a word, just held it out with both hands like it was something heavy, something she didn't want to carry alone anymore. I read it standing in the kitchen of the house I grew up in, the same kitchen where she used to make biscuits on Sunday mornings, where my grandfather's old radio sat on the counter for 30 years collecting grease and memories. Notice of eminent domain acquisition. Effective in 90 days. The county was expanding the highway interchange. Our property sat directly in the path of the new on-ramp. They were taking the house. Not asking, taking. And the compensation they offered was so far below market value it felt like an insult wrapped in legal language. My mother sat down at the kitchen table and didn't say anything. She was 61 years old, and she had lived in that house since she was 23. She'd raised me there after my father left. She'd cared for my grandfather there until he passed. She'd buried 2 dogs in the backyard under the oak tree. And now some county commissioner, with a highway budget and a signature stamp, was going to bulldoze all of it. I told her we'd figure it out. I told her not to worry. I said the things you say when you don't actually know what you're going to do. My name is Connor, and this is the story of the worst 6 months of my life turning into something I still can't fully explain. Even now, even after everything. My mother's name is Beverly. She's the kind of woman who never complains, who fixes things quietly without asking for help, who could stretch a $40 grocery budget into a week's worth of real meals. She didn't deserve any of what happened, none of it, but she also didn't deserve what we found at the end. That part I'll get to. After the notice came, I took a week off from my job at a mechanical contracting firm in Raleigh and drove down to Carteret County to help her sort through what we could keep, what we could sell, and where we were going to go. The county's buyout offer was the $118,000. The house was worth at least $210,000, our realtor said. We hired a property attorney who told us we could fight it, and we tried. We filed objections. We submitted comparable sales data. We hired an appraiser. 3 months later, the county came back with $127,100 and a deadline. The attorney told us that was probably as good as it was going to get. Fighting longer would cost more than the difference. My mother signed the papers at a folding table in a county building that smelled like floor cleaner and old carpet. She didn't cry. She just asked the clerk if they needed anything else, thanked her, and walked out to my truck. She stared out the window the whole drive home. When we pulled into the driveway, she said, "I need to find somewhere to put the bird feeders." That was all she said. With $127,500 and no mortgage left to pay off. She'd owned the place free and clear. We had enough to buy something, but not much. Not in any market near Raleigh where I lived. Not anywhere near the coast where she had friends. We started looking further inland, further out, further from anything convenient. That's how we found the listing for a property in Craven County. 11 acres, a 2-bedroom farmhouse built in 1937, a detached barn, a hand-dug well that still pulled water, and access to a creek that ran along the back edge of the property. The asking price was $89,000. The listing photos showed a house that had not been loved in a very long time. Sagging porch, roof with visible soft spots, interior walls with water staining that spread across the ceilings like old bruises. The listing had been sitting for 240 days. Nobody wanted it. We drove out on a Thursday morning in March. The road to it turned to gravel about a mile before the property line, and my truck kicked up pale dust the whole way in. When we pulled up and got out, my mother walked to the edge of the porch, pressed one board with her foot, decided it would hold, and stepped up. She stood there looking out at the overgrown field in front of her and said, "I can work with this." I wasn't as sure. I walked through the interior and counted the problems. The subfloor in the back bedroom had soft spots from old water damage. The kitchen ceiling had a section of collapsed plaster. The electrical panel was a 1960s fuse box that should have been replaced before the Reagan administration. One of the windows in the living room was boarded up from the outside with a piece of plywood that had warped in the weather. But the bones of the place, the framing, the foundation, the chimney, Those looked solid, better than I expected. We offered $79,000. The seller countered at $85,000. We met in the middle. 37 days later, my mother had a new address, 11 acres, and a farmhouse that needed about $40,000 of work it wasn't going to get all at once. I drove back to Raleigh, negotiated remote work for 2 months from my supervisor, a reasonable man named Ted who had worked with me long enough to trust me, and came back to help. We started with what mattered most. Roof first. I hired a local crew for that, 3 guys who worked fast and charged fairly. Then the electrical. Brought in a licensed electrician who shook his head at the fuse box, like it had personally offended him. We replaced the subfloor in the back bedroom ourselves, my mother and I, over the course of a very long weekend that left us both aching in places we hadn't thought about in years. She was better at squaring the boards than I was. I didn't tell her that, but I thought it. The kitchen plaster we left for later. The boarded window I unboarded, found the glass intact underneath, cleaned it up and reseated the glazing. We worked our way through the house methodically, the way you do when you can't afford to do everything at once. Triage first, comfort second, cosmetic last. The property had good bones. The more I worked on it, the more I believed that. The framing in the exterior walls was old-growth longleaf pine, the kind of wood that had gotten harder with age instead of softer. The floors in the living room and dining room were heart pine boards nearly 3 inches wide, hidden under 60 years of floor paint that we stripped back in sections. Underneath the paint, they were beautiful. I was measuring the dining room for new baseboard trim on a cold afternoon in early April when I noticed something. I was measuring wall length, standard practice before cutting trim, and the number didn't add up. I measured the exterior of the south wall from outside, 42 feet from corner to corner. I measured the interior south wall from inside, 34 feet and 4 inches. The difference wasn't explained by the wall thickness. The walls in this house were standard framed, 5.5 inches on most exterior walls, maybe 6 with the old plaster coat. I would expect to lose about a foot total from both sides, not 7.5 feet. I stood there for a moment holding my tape measure and looked at the wall again. The south end of the interior was dominated by a large brick fireplace, floor to ceiling, built solid and wide, the kind of fireplace you don't see in newer construction, because it takes a mason half a week and costs more than most people want to spend on something you can replace with a gas insert. On either side of the fireplace, built-in shelving, pine boards, painted white, heavy with old books and ceramic figurines, and the accumulated objects of whoever had lived here before. I pressed my hand against the shelving on the right side of the fireplace. It felt solid. I pressed the left side. Same thing. I knocked on both sections the way you knock on walls when you're looking for studs, and that's when I heard it. The right section sounded full, dense. The left section, when I knocked 3 times, gave back a tone that was hollow in a way that the right side wasn't. I stood there for a long time before I said anything. I went and found my mother in the back bedroom where she was repainting the trim. I told her what I'd found, or what I thought I'd found. She set down her brush very carefully and came with me to the dining room. She stood in front of that shelving unit and listened while I knocked again. Right side full, left side hollow. She said, "Well, let's find out what it is." We cleared the shelves. It took about 20 minutes. There were a lot of old books, paperback westerns mostly, some Reader's Digest condensed editions from the 70s, a ceramic rooster, 3 glass insulators from old telephone poles, a coffee can full of mismatched drawer pulls. When the shelves were bare, I looked at the back panel. Pine boards, the same as the shelf surfaces. I pressed against it. It moved, not much, just a 1/4 inch, but it moved. I got a flat pry bar from my toolbox. My mother stood behind me with her arms crossed, watching. I worked the edge of the pry bar into the seam at the top of the back panel and applied gentle pressure, and the whole panel swung outward on a hinge I hadn't seen because it was set into the interior edge of the frame. Behind it was a door, not a wall. A door, solid wood, painted the same color as the surrounding plaster so it had been invisible from the dining room side for what was probably decades. There was a keyhole. No key. My mother said quietly, "Go get the hammer and the thin chisel." I went and got the hammer and the thin chisel. Between the two of us, it took 11 minutes to work the old lock mechanism free. I'm not proud of that, but I'm not ashamed of it either. This was our house. Every inch of it was ours now. The door opened into a room. Not a closet, not a crawl space. A room, maybe 9 feet wide and 12 feet deep, with a plank floor and rough plaster walls and a single small window, maybe 8 inches by 12, set so high in the south wall that it was above the built-in shelving on the exterior and invisible from outside, unless you knew what you were looking for. The window had been painted black from the interior side. The room was not empty. There was an old wooden chair, a metal folding table with a leg that had been repaired with electrical tape and wire, a canvas camp cot with a moldy mattress rolled up on top of it. On the table, a kerosene lamp, a box of wooden matches, 3 mason jars with their lids sealed tight, and a flat metal document box, gray-painted steel, about the size of a large laptop, held shut with a hasp and a padlock that looked newer than everything else in the room. I looked at my mother. She looked at me. She said, "Whose room was this?" I didn't know. The cellar had been the estate of a man named Vincent Aldridge, who had died without a will and whose heirs, 2 adult children who hadn't spoken to each other in 15 years, had agreed to sell the property just to end the argument over it. I'd never met Vincent Aldridge. All I knew was that he had bought this property in 1981 and lived on it alone until he was moved to a memory care facility in 2019. He passed in 2022. The house had sat vacant for 3 years before we bought it. The mason jars on the table held papers, rolled documents. I could see that through the glass. I didn't open them that day. I'm not sure why. Something about the room felt like it deserved time. We closed the hidden door, put the shelving panel back in place, and I sat with my mother at the kitchen table while she made coffee, and neither of us said much. That night, I lay awake in the room I was sleeping in and thought about who builds a hidden room in their house and why. There are a lot of answers to that question. Most of them aren't good. The next morning, I opened the mason jars. The first jar held a series of hand-drawn survey maps, detailed ones, with measurements and compass bearings and small notations in pencil. They appeared to show the same stretch of land from different dates. The earliest notation I found was 1974. The latest was 1983. I couldn't tell immediately what land they were showing, but the topography, the creek line, the ridge, the notation of a timber easement looked familiar. The second jar held letters, personal ones, written to someone named Vincent, signed by different names, spanning from the late 1970s into the mid-1980s. I didn't read them all, but I read enough to understand that Vincent Aldridge had, at some point in that period, been involved in a property dispute of some significance. The letters referenced a company, Stonebridge Land Partners. I knew that name. Stonebridge Land Partners was a real estate holding company that had operated throughout eastern North Carolina starting in the late 1970s. I knew it because 2 years earlier, a local investigative reporter had published a piece. I'd read it at the time without thinking much of it, about Stonebridge's acquisition practices in rural counties. The allegation was that the company had used fraudulent tax assessments, fabricated liens, and in some cases outright forged documentation to acquire land from elderly and low-income landowners at far below market value, then flipped those properties to development interests. The reported figure involved across all transactions was somewhere north of $200 million over 4 decades. The investigation had stalled. The company's founding principal, a man named Harlan Voss, was in his 80s, had been through 3 rounds of litigation that never resulted in conviction, and had retained attorneys who were very good at running out the clock. The county DA's office had reportedly opened a file and then quietly closed it. The story had dropped off the radar. The third mason jar held a single envelope, sealed, addressed to no one. Inside was a folded document, 4 pages, handwritten in the careful, slanted script of a man who had learned penmanship in a different era. At the top of the first page, in capital letters, This is what they did to me and to others. If you are reading this, I am probably gone. I sat down in the chair in the hidden room and I read all 4 pages. Vincent Aldridge had owned a parcel of 48 acres adjacent to his farmhouse property. A separate parcel, land that had been in his family since his grandfather's time. In 1979, a Stonebridge Land Partners representative approached him about selling it. He declined. 3 months later, a tax lien appeared on the parcel, a lien he had never been notified of and that he believed was fabricated. Stonebridge moved to acquire the property through lien foreclosure. He fought it, lost, appealed. The appeal was dismissed on procedural grounds. He lost the 48 acres for $8,200. They sold it 18 months later to a timber company for $91,000. But Vincent Aldridge had not given up. He had spent the following years quietly documenting what Stonebridge had done, not just to him, but to others. The survey maps in the first jar showed the boundaries of properties he had tracked. The letters were from neighbors, other victims, who had shared their stories with him. And at the end of the 4-page document, in the same careful handwriting, he had listed names, dates, parcel numbers, and transaction amounts. 17 separate properties in 4 counties, each one with a note beside it describing the mechanism used: false lien, fraudulent assessment, forged heir signature, manufactured code violation. The last line he had written was, "I could not make them stop, but maybe the truth can outlast them." I sat in that room for a long time. I called my mother in and read her the document. She sat on the edge of the camp cot frame and listened without speaking. When I finished, she said, "We need to call somebody." We did not call just somebody. I spent that evening on my laptop making a list of who needed to know what and in what order. The next morning, I called the reporter who had written the original Stonebridge piece. Her name was Andrea. She worked for a regional news outlet in Raleigh, and she picked up on the second ring. I told her what I had found. She asked me 3 questions, and then she said, "Don't move anything. I'm coming to you." She drove 3 hours. She brought a photographer. She spent 4 hours in the hidden room with a document scanner and a notebook, and when she came back out, her expression was the kind that people have when they know they're holding something significant. She said, "This is the original ledger documentation that Stonebridge's attorneys claimed didn't exist." Voss's defense in the 2019 civil case was that the company had no documentation of the lien origination process for those parcels. He said the records were lost in a flood. She paused. Vincent Aldridge apparently disagreed. The mason jars had been sealed with paraffin wax around the lid threads. The documents inside were in near-perfect condition. What followed was not fast. I want to be clear about that. It took 9 months. There were attorneys involved, a firm in Raleigh that took the case on a contingency basis after Andrea's first article ran. There was a state attorney general's office investigation that had quietly been ongoing and now had evidence it had been missing. There were depositions and document authentication procedures and a great deal of waiting. Harlan Voss, at 84 years old, did not go to trial. His attorneys negotiated a settlement, the terms of which included a substantial restitution fund for documented victims of Stonebridge's acquisition practices, disgorgement of profits from 17 transactions in 4 counties, and the dissolution of all remaining Stonebridge entities. The total figure, when the settlement was finalized, was just over $230 million in combined restitution and penalties. I read about the settlement on my phone while sitting on the porch of my mother's farmhouse, the same porch where she had pressed the boards with her foot and said she could work with it. The morning was cool, and the field out front had been bush-hogged and was starting to look like something again. She had planted a kitchen garden along the south side of the house. The bird feeders were hung from a post near the barn, 3 of them. I thought about Vincent Aldridge in that hidden room, by lamplight, sealing his jars, writing his last careful pages, trusting that someday someone would find what he left behind. One of the things the attorneys handled was a claim on behalf of Vincent Aldridge's estate. The 48 acres that had been taken from him through the fraudulent lien were long since sold and resold and could not be returned. But the restitution calculation for his parcel, accounting for original value, development appreciation, and compounding, resulted in a payment to his estate of just under $400,000. His two estranged adult children, who had sold us the farmhouse without a second thought, received it. I don't know what they did with it. That's not my story to tell. What I can tell you is this. When the settlement was announced, my mother was in the kitchen making coffee, and I came in and told her. She stood at the counter for a moment with her back to me. Then she turned around and her eyes were wet and she said, "That poor man, he just wanted somebody to listen." I said, "Somebody did." She nodded and poured the coffee, and that was that. We fixed the hidden room, took out the camp cot and the folding table and the old chair, repointed the plaster where it had cracked. Found a small double-hung window at an architectural salvage yard that fit the opening after we removed the one that had been painted black. Light comes in there now in the afternoon. My mother uses the room for sewing. There's a proper table in it, and a lamp and a chair that doesn't have electrical tape on the legs. Some mornings I sit out on the porch before she's up and I think about the way a house can hold things. Not just furniture and paint, and the wear marks people leave on floors, but the things people hide in them, the things they can't say out loud, the evidence of the life they actually lived. Vincent Aldridge built a room behind a bookcase and filled it with the truth because he had nowhere else to put it. He sealed it in glass jars because he wanted it to survive him. He wrote it in careful handwriting because he believed, even at the end, that it mattered. It mattered. The farmhouse still needs work. There's a section of the barn roof that needs attention before next winter. The hand-dug well pump needs a new pressure tank. The back pasture fence is a project for the spring. My mother has opinions about all of it, and she is usually right. But the bones are good, better than I knew when we bought it. And underneath the old paint and the water stains and the soft spots and the years of being left alone, there was something worth finding. There almost always is.